I am going to tell you about the day I stole a coat and accidentally saved the world, or at least one small piece of it. This story to my cousin Ambrose, to the old men who drink palm wine behind the Port Authority building, and once to a Vreth arbitration officer who was trying to decide whether to incinerate me. None of them fully believed me. I do not entirely blame them. My name is Ikifi. At the time of these events, I was 23 years old and employed as a presser and runner at Madame Ravang's Blanchisserie Centrale on the Rue des Pêcheurs in Vella. That is the port city on the equatorial coast, the one they built on top of the old fishing settlement. When the Vreth Colonization Administrated decided that humans needed to be organized into zones of productive labor. You may know Vella for its humidity, its smell of salt and diesel, and something sweet and wrong underneath both, or for the fact that roughly 60% of the planet's alien population lives within 10 kilometers of its harbor, the Vreth-like proximity to water. Something about the atmospheric pressure near large bodies of it slows their scent processing and lets them think more clearly. I have always found this ironic, given what happened. The Blanchisserie was a narrow building, 3 floors of steam and noise, industrial pressing units on the ground floor, sorting and finishing on the second, and the cold storage and vehicle intake on the third. We handled laundry for the Vreth administrative offices, which meant military uniforms, duty robes, the ceremonial wrappings they wore for their legal proceedings. We also handled laundry for the humans who could afford it. The traders, port officials, the few families who had made themselves useful enough to the administration to live in what passed for comfort, pressed a great many uniforms. We lost a great many buttons. I had been working at the Blanchisserie for 2 years by then. Before that, I had worked at the harbor unloading freight containers. And before that, I had done odd work around the market district, the kind of work that exists in the margins of a controlled economy, carrying, fetching, knowing which way to look when certain people needed not to be seen. Vela was a city that ran on that kind of knowledge. The Vreth administration had organized everything they could see, and everything they could see functioned on their terms, and everything beneath the level of their attention functioned on human terms. And a young man with quick hands and a good sense of what was below that line could keep himself fed and housed, and mostly out of trouble. I had been in and out of trouble often enough to know its shape. This particular morning began as trouble I recognized and became something I had no name for. In those 2 years at the Blanchisserie, I had learned several things about the work. I had learned that a pressing iron left at exactly the wrong temperature will destroy a Vreth duty robe in approximately 4 seconds, and that the smell is unforgettable. I had learned that Madame Ravang's preferred method of management was a slow, deliberate silence that communicated more threat than any shouting could, and that this silence had a specific variant it took on when she knew you had done something wrong, and was deciding how long to let you know that she knew before she addressed it. A silence that had its own weight and texture, like a garment that needs pressing but you are afraid to touch. I had learned that the vehicle intake on the 3rd floor received, on average, 3 high-class Vreth administrative transports per week, left by their owners for interior cleaning and scent neutralization, and that these vehicles sat unattended in the intake bay for between 2 and 4 hours at a stretch, and that no one on the staff paid much attention to them because the vehicles were not our business, only their contents. And I had learned that a woman named Aminata came in every Thursday morning to drop off her employer's dress uniforms, that she had eyes the color of the bay at low tide, and that she had never once looked directly at me. This had been true for 2 years and showed no signs of changing by natural means. It was a Thursday. I want to be clear that what I did was stupid. I have thought about it many times since, and I cannot find a version of the thinking that makes it not stupid. But I was 23, and she had those eyes, and there was a coat. The coat had come in Tuesday with a batch of administrative garments from the Vreth Regional Authority offices. It was a human coat, which was unusual. Most human employees of the administration wore standard issue coveralls, gray, green, and shapeless, designed to make no particular impression in either direction. This coat was different, dark blue, almost black, with a cut that suggested its owner had spent considerable money. making himself look like a person who spent considerable money. Wool blend, with a high collar and a structure to the shoulders that was not accidental. It had been left in the administrative batch by error, no claim tag, no owner record. Just this coat, sitting among the duty robes like a man who had walked into the wrong meeting and was waiting to see if anyone would notice. Madame Ravang had pressed it, hung it on the unclaimed rack and forgotten about it, because Madame Ravang forgot nothing, but pretended to forget things she found beneath her attention. I looked at that coat on Wednesday. I thought, whoever owns this coat is the kind of person Aminata has probably met. The kind of person who moves through the world looking like he belongs, wherever he has decided to be. I looked at it again on Thursday morning, 40 minutes before Aminata's usual arrival time. I was on the ground floor, pulling the morning queue, and the unclaimed rack was visible from the queue station. And the coat was right there. Took it off the rack and put it on in the stairwell. It fit. That was the first piece of bad luck, because if it had not fit, I would have put it back, and that would have been the end of it. But it fit as though it had been made for me, and when I came down the stairs and walked through the ground floor toward the intake bay stairs, one of the other pressers, a man named Rusiga, who had been at the blanchisserie for 11 years and had seen everything, including 2 different ownership changes, a fire in the intake bay, and the morning that the senior enforcement officer came in and arrested the previous head presser, for reasons no one ever explained, looked up from his iron and looked at me, and said nothing, which from Rusiga was the same as a full review and a favorable verdict. I went upstairs to the intake bay. There were 2 vehicles in the bay that morning. One was a standard Vreth administrative transport, low and wide and smelling of the citrus chemical compound they use to mask their natural scent around humans, the kind of vehicle you saw in the streets 100 times a day and stopped registering after a while. The other was a private luxury conveyance, the kind the senior administrative officials used, larger, with tinted environmental panels, a rear compartment sealed with a privacy barrier. This one had come in the previous afternoon, drop-off by a Vreth official, whose name I did not catch. Interior cleaning requested. No pickup time specified. It was the kind of vehicle that suggested its owner was not concerned about schedules, because people who were uncertain about schedules did not drive things that cost what this cost. I stood in the bay in that coat and I thought, Aminata will come in the front entrance in approximately 35 minutes. The vehicle bay exit opened onto the side alley. The side alley connected to the Rue des Pêcheurs 2 buildings down. If I went out that way and came around to the front, I would be standing on the front steps as if I had just arrived from somewhere important. In a coat that looked like somewhere important had sent me, 35 minutes of standing on the steps of the blanchisserie, visible, present, wearing the coat. That was the extent of the plan. I sat in the driver's position of the luxury transport to think about whether the plan had any serious flaws beyond the obvious ones. The environmental panels were set to exterior view, which meant I could see the alley outside, while remaining invisible from it. The interior smelled of something I had never encountered before. Not the citrus compound the administrative vehicles used, not the usual flat Vreth administrative scent, but something older and sharper, layered in a way that ordinary administrative vehicles were not. Iron, dried flowers. Something faintly electrical, like the air before a storm. The kind of smell that had a history to it, that had been accumulating for years rather than hours. I noticed that the privacy barrier between the driver's position and the rear compartment was not fully sealed. There was a gap of perhaps 4 centimeters at the lower edge, where the barrier had been pulled across but not locked. I noticed the gap because there was a sound coming through it. It was a very small sound, a breath held carefully and then released in the precise, controlled way that people learn when they have been in small spaces for a long time and have understood that the quality of their breathing is the only staying between them and discovery. The kind of breath you do not learn by accident. The kind you learn because someone taught you, because necessity taught you when you were very young and the lesson stayed. I sat still. The sound came again, turned in the seat, and looked through the gap in the privacy barrier. The rear compartment was dark, the environmental panels set to opaque. I could see almost nothing, shapes, the suggestion of the seat, the geometry of the space. But the iron and flower's scent was much stronger here, pressed against the barrier, and there was warmth on the other side that had not been there when I first sat down. I had a feeling, sitting there, that I had felt before in specific situations. The feeling of a door that was already open, that you had not opened, that you were not certain you wanted to go through, but that you understood you were going to walk through, regardless, because the alternative was to turn away from something that had already seen you. Hello, I said, in breath contact pidgin. Every human in Vela learned whether they wanted to or not. The silence on the other side of the barrier had a new quality to it. Hello, said a voice, very small. Careful with the syllables, the careful of someone who has learned a language from a teacher rather than from the street, has practiced the words but never had to use them until now. I opened the privacy barrier. She was sitting in the far corner of the rear compartment, as far from the barrier as the space allowed, knees drawn to her chest, back against the environmental panel. She was, I estimated, perhaps the equivalent of 8 or 9 human years old, though I was not then, and am not now, an expert in Vreth developmental stages, and the comparison is imprecise in any case, because Vreth childhood and human childhood are not the same kind of time. She was small, waist-high if she had been standing, which she was not. She had the compound eyes all Vreth had. Hers were a different shade than the administrative officials I had grown up around. Theirs were a flat amber gray, the color of old administrative paper, the color of things that had been processed and filed and forgotten. Hers were a deep copper green, lit from some interior source I could not identify, and they were fixed on me with an attention I can only describe as complete, not the wide, unfocused stare of fear, but the specific targeted attention of someone taking inventory of a new and uncertain situation, cataloging everything that might matter. She wore a robe that had been expensive once. The embroidery at the collar was the kind I had seen on high administrative officials, the geometric borderwork that indicated rank or lineage, in a metallic thread that was dull now, but had clearly been bright. The robe was torn at the shoulder, a long tear that ran diagonally across the fabric. There was a stain on the shoulder that had dried dark, not fresh, hours old at least. She was holding a bundle wrapped in cloth, pressed against her chest with both arms, her hands locked around it with the grip of someone who had decided that this object was not going to be separated from her, regardless of what else happened. I am not a criminal, I said, in breath contact pidgin. This seemed like an important thing to establish immediately. She stared at me. I am a laundry worker, I said. This is a laundry. You are in a vehicle that was brought to a laundry. She said something in formal Vreth that I did not fully understand. My pidgin was functional but not sophisticated. I had enough to do business and avoid serious misunderstandings and navigate most encounters with the administrative staff. But formal Vreth was a different register. More precise, with grammatical structures that marked social position and legal status in ways that changed the meaning of individual words, caught individual words. Shelter request, temporary, and a word I had heard before in administrative contexts, but never in casual conversation. A word that marked a specific category of legal status under Vreth administrative law, the word for an unaffiliated minor whose lineage authority had been disrupted, the word for a child without standing. I looked at the bundle she was holding. I looked at her torn robe. I looked at the stain on her shoulder. I thought about the formal word she had used, which carried the weight of an entire administrative system in its syllables, a system that had opinions about who this child was and what should happen to her, and whose opinions I was, apparently now adjacent to whether I had chosen to be or... All right, I said. I do not know exactly what I meant by that. I think I meant, I acknowledge that this situation has become something I did not plan for. I think I also meant, I am not going to leave you here. Those two meanings sat inside the same two words because there was nowhere else for them to go. I had approximately 30 minutes before Aminata arrived. I had approximately 2 hours before the blanchisserie staff would need access to this vehicle for interior cleaning. I was beginning to understand, considerably less time than either of those before something else happened, because there were sounds coming from the street below the intake bay that were not the sounds of a normal morning. Particular, modulated frequency hum that breath enforcement units emitted when they were operating in active pursuit configuration. A sound every human in Vela learned to recognize and respond to. The response being to continue whatever you were doing without any visible change, simultaneously becoming intensely aware of your own body and its relationship to every exit in your immediate environment, was audible now from the direction of the harbor road. I have thought many times about what I should have done at that moment. I have run through the alternatives with the same attention I give to the pressing cue when I am trying to understand a difficult piece. I should have told the child to stay in the vehicle and get out through the intake bay exit and go back to my iron and let the enforcement units find their own way to whatever they were looking for. That was the sensible thing. That was the thing that kept Ikafi, age 23, laundry worker, person who was not part of this, alive and employed and uninvolved. What I actually did was take the child out of the vehicle, wrap her in a clean pre-cloth I took from the intake bay shelving, a standard size, the kind used for finishing large garments, large enough to cover most of her and serve as an unremarkable bundle, and carry her down the back stairs of the blanchisserie before I had finished, deciding to do it. The decision and the action happened at the same moment, which is not always a good sign, but is sometimes the only honest way a decision can be made. I want to explain something about the breath enforcement units before I explain what happened in the streets, because understanding the next hour requires understanding what they were capable of and what they were not. They were not like the administrative officials who came and went through the blanchisserie. Those were bureaucrats. They had the same biological equipment as the enforcers. The compound eyes and the scent processing apparatus and the height and the careful neutral movement through human-occupied space. They had learned to function in proximity to humans through years of administrative work, and they carried themselves with the particular weariness of people who spent their days managing things that confused them and had made a kind of peace with the confusion. They noticed things, but they noticed them through the filter of their paperwork, their categories, taste, their administrative expectations of what a thing should be. The enforcement units had been selected and trained for something different. Their scent processing was not the ambient, passive reading that administrative breath performed. It was active, directed, the result of specific training that developed their olfactory capability beyond what normal breath physiology produced. A breath enforcer in active pursuit mode could detect and track the biochemical signature of a specific individual at approximately 400 meters in open air under normal atmospheric conditions and considerably further downwind. They could distinguish individuals by the particular combination of compounds their nervous systems produced. They could follow a trail hours old through a crowd of hundreds. And they could. This was the part of their capability that gave every human in Vela the particular cold clarity that certain pieces of information produce. They detect the specific biochemical signature of guilt, not fear, not stress. Those were easy, they could read those too. So could any creature that had lived alongside humans long enough. What the enforcement units had been trained to read was the more specific compound profile produced by a human nervous system under the particular condition of actively doing something it knew it should not do. The stress compounds were part of it, but there was a third compound involved. Something the human body produced at the intersection of awareness and transgression that their analysis could isolate from ordinary stress. They had been using this capability to manage human populations in breath-administered settlements for 100 years. I was wearing a stolen coat, was carrying a child who was clearly the subject of an active enforcement operation. My body, by any reasonable biochemical measure, producing guilt signature at a rate that should have been visible to anything within 100 meters. I went out through the back alley at a walk because running produces a different signature. The flight compounds are distinct from the guilt compounds but flag a separate alert category, and the enforcement training covered flight biochemistry as thoroughly as guilt biochemistry. I walked. The pressing cloth bundle my arms shifted as the child adjusted her weight, and I felt her hands grip my collar through the cloth. 2 small points of pressure that were the only indication she was there. I turned left onto the Rue des Marchands, which runs parallel to the Rue des Pêcheurs, and is typically crowded with morning market traffic. Vendors, buyers, delivery workers, the general movement of a port city's commercial life that the Vreth administration had organized into zones and schedules, but had never fully controlled, because the market exists in the gaps between schedules and zones and always has. I moved into the crowd and let it take me, matching pace with the people around me, holding the bundle against my chest, the way a delivery worker holds a package he has been carrying since early morning and is tired of. The enforcement units entered the Rue des Marchands from the harbor end. There were 3 of them. This was a full pursuit team. I knew this because Rusiga had once explained the unit configurations to me when I was new to the blanchisserie, and Siga was in one of his rare moods for explanation. 1 unit does a sweep, 2 units do a corridor, 3 units do a compression. They move in formation designed to push the target toward a narrowing point, 2 flanking positions, and 1 in direct pursuit, and they coordinate through a subsonic signaling system that humans cannot hear. 3 units meant someone had decided this was a serious operation and had committed the resources accordingly. They moved differently from the administrative Vreth I was used to. Not the managed, careful movement of officials navigating human space, something more direct and more unsettling. The movement of creatures who have decided that the space between them and their objective is a problem to be solved rather than a context to be respected. The humans in the market moved out of their path without being asked and without looking at them, which was the behavior that Vreth enforcement presence produced in inhuman populations. Not panic, not confrontation, just the smooth, unconscious rerouting of foot traffic around something that the body had assessed and registered as requiring distance. I turned into a stall selling dried fish and stood with my back to the street and looked at the fish. The child's grip on my collar tightened. I want to explain what I was doing, because what I was doing was not pretending. Performing calm, forming innocence, does not work against Vreth enforcers because performing is itself a form of conscious deception, and conscious deception produces its own compound profile, distinct from the guilt signature, but flaggable in its own right. What I was doing was trying to actually think about the fish. To actually be a man standing in front of a fish stall looking at fish, in the way that a man standing in front of a fish stall looking at fish actually is. The fish were small, salt-dried, laid out in rows on a low tray with a weight cloth over the back half to keep the flies off the ones not currently being inspected. 8. The vendor had sourced them from the harbor catch, which came in early morning, and they had been salted and dried in the commercial drying shed 2 streets over that you could smell from anywhere in the market district on hot days. The drying process removed approximately 60% of the moisture content and concentrated the flavor in a way that made a small dried fish, soaked briefly and cooked with rice, one of the more reliable meals available to a person on a laundry worker's wages. I had eaten many of these fish. I knew their smell. I knew the specific texture of the salt crust along the backbone and the way the flesh separated when you soaked it, coming apart in small, clean pieces that were good mixed with the starch. I thought about fish. One of the enforcement units passed within 2 meters of my back. I heard the change in the frequency hum as it came close. A slight rise, the active scan adjustment. And then the slight fall as it moved on, and I thought about fish until the sound was 10 meters away and then 15. And then I let out a breath that I had been holding for approximately 40 seconds without being aware of holding it. I bought a small dried fish from the vendor because I had been standing there for 30 seconds. And he was looking at me, and because the most natural completion of a man standing in front of a fish stall is buying a fish, and because I needed something to hold in my hand besides the pressing cloth. He wrapped it in a square of old administrative form paper, the kind that circulated through the market as scrap, and I took it and moved back into the foot traffic of the Rue des Marchands. The child watched me do this from over my shoulder, her copper-green eyes visible above the top edge of the pressing cloth. "I don't have a plan," I said quietly in pidgin, facing forward and keeping my voice below the noise of the market. "I want you to know that in advance." She said something. I understand some of that, I said. The part about danger I understood. What I understood of her situation was assembled over the next 20 minutes as we moved through the back streets and alleys of the market district. She speaking in formal breath and pigeon fragments and occasional gestures. I interpreting as best I could and asking for repetition when I lost the thread. The picture that emerged was this. She was the daughter of a Vreth administrative official of significant rank. Not the highest rank, but the kind of rank that has actual authority rather than the simulation of authority. The kind that makes decisions other people have to implement. Father had died. How he had died she either did not say, or I did not have enough formal Vreth to follow. The fact of the death had created a jurisdictional gap. Under Vreth administrative law, an unaffiliated minor of high lineage, a child without a surviving parent of the appropriate rank, was placed under the immediate authority of the nearest ranking official of the same lineage class. This was an administrative automatic built into the succession protocols. That the official who would claim that placement authority was the official who had arranged for her father's death. She used a word for this arrangement that was beyond my pigeon, but whose meaning was clear from everything else she had said. The bundle she was holding was a data archive. Small, physical, the old recording format the Vreth used for documents they did not trust to networked storage because networked storage could be reached and revised by people with the right access credentials. Physical archives could not be revised after the fact. They were what they were when they were made. Her father had made this one, and it contained documentation of what had been done to him, and evidence of who had done it, and it had been placed in the vehicle because the vehicle was the one location her father's adversary had not thought to search, because the vehicle belonged to a third party who had no connection to the succession dispute and no reason to be involved in it. So your evidence, I said. We were in the alley behind the Port Authority Auxiliary Building, standing in the shade of the concrete overhang, and I had given her the dried fish because she had looked at it with an expression that crossed every species barrier I was aware of. You and what you're carrying. Together your evidence of what happened and who did it. She had been eating the fish in small, precise bites. She looked up. And the official who's after you needs you not to have delivered it anywhere yet, I said, because once it's delivered, you can't be disappeared to prevent delivery. She said something I only partially caught. A word for confirmation. A word I associated with formal legal proceedings. So we need to get it delivered, I said. She watched me. I thought about the enforcement perimeter. 3 units, full compression, originating from the blanchisserie. They would have confirmed that I had left the vehicle with her, or, at least, they would have registered my presence in the vehicle and her departure from the official record of her last known location and drawn the obvious conclusion. The compression spiral would be working outward from the blanchisserie as the center, which meant that at this point in the operation, the area closest to the blanchisserie was behind the advancing perimeter. Already searched, already cleared. I need to go back to work, I said. She looked at me for a long moment with those copper-green eyes. She did not say anything. To the blanchisserie, I said. I need to go back to my pressing iron. What I was working out as I said it was this. The Vreth enforcement training accounted for flight patterns, for hiding places, misdirection. It was calibrated against everything a hunted person does, because hunted people are what it was built to process. But there is a category of human behavior that does not exist in a prey and pursuit framework, because it requires a specific combination of qualities that prey, by definition, do not typically have. It requires the ability to be calm, not through the suppression of fear, but through the genuine displacement of fear by something else. By the absorption in work, by the practice of an ordinary skill repeated until it occupies the whole of the attention and leaves no room for the compounds. It's that flag pursuit. An animal that is being hunted cannot do this. An animal is afraid, or it is not afraid, and the chemistry tells the truth about which. But a person who has done the same work 10,000 times and who is actually doing it, who is genuinely thinking about it, rather than think about anything else. A person like that produces a signature that is not the signature, flight, and is not the signature of hiding. It is the signature of a man at work, and a man at work in a laundry, pressing uniforms, is not a useful object of attention for an enforcement operation looking for a fugitive. We went out of the alley and back toward the blanchisserie. I went in through the side entrance. Rusiga was at his station. He looked at me, looked at the child, looked at the coat. He set his iron down with the deliberate care he used when he was thinking. Then he picked it back up and returned to his work, because Rusiga had been at the blanchisserie for 11 years and understood, with the bone-deep clarity of someone who had seen the administration's enforcement operations come and go, and had survived all of them. Some mornings required a man to see only what he was looking at. I settled the child in the finishing alcove on the second floor, a recessed area beside the landing, used for completed tagged items waiting for pickup, warm from the pressing units below, smelling of clean finished cloth, not visible from the street-facing windows or from the intake bay above. I gave her the rest of the dried fish. I checked that the pressing cloth still covered her well enough that a casual glance down the alcove would see a pile of finishing work and nothing else. I went to my station. I picked up the next item in the pressing queue, a Vreth administrative duty robe, standard grade, the most common item in our inventory, and I began to press it. The duty robe required 8 passes to achieve the correct finish. I knew this without having to calculate it. The first pass was the longest, down the central panel, establishing the primary crease lines. The second and third were the shoulder folds, which had to match within a tolerance that the Vreth administrative dress code specified in a document that Madame Ravang had posted above the pressing stations in the first year I worked there, and which I had read often enough that I could recite it, not because I had tried to memorize it, but because I had read it so many times that it had organized itself in my memory without effort. Fourth pass was the collar facing. Fifth and sixth were the sleeves, which required particular attention because the sleeve seam met the shoulder, fold at an angle, and if the temperature was slightly high and the pass slightly slow, you would get a ghost crease along the seam that was nearly invisible until the garment was worn, and then was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The Vreth administrative dress code had opinions about ghost creases too. Seventh pass was the lower hem. Eighth pass was a light finish pass over the whole garment to set the work. I did the first pass. I heard the enforcement units come back. Frequency hum entered from the service entrance at street level. 2 units on the ground floor, in the space in the same way I had seen them, work the Rue des Marchands. Not aggressive, not announcing themselves, just moving and breathing, letting the air tell them what they needed to know. The pressers on the ground floor continued pressing. I heard Rusiga's iron make the specific sound it made at the end of a pass, a slight increase in pressure as he set it at the turning point, and then the clean reversal stroke that was his signature, the move that told you. Rusiga had been doing this long enough that his hand knew things his mind did not have to be consulted about. I did the second pass. The shoulder fold on the left side. The temperature was correct. The crease settled exactly where it was supposed to settle. One of the enforcement units came upstairs. I heard it on the second floor. It moved through the sorting area, through the space between the hanging racks, toward the finishing section. The hum of its active scan was very clear up here. The sound had a directional quality I had not noticed in the open street, a focused precision that I now understood was the focused precision of an instrument that was working. I did the third pass. The shoulder fold on the right side. The unit entered the finishing area. It passed the alcove. I did the fourth pass. The collar facing. The collar on a standard duty robe has a particular resistance. The material is doubled at the facing for structural reasons, and doubled material requires a slightly slower pass and a slightly lower temperature to avoid the ghost crease at the fold. And I thought about this resistance and about the correct response to it, with the same attention I would have given it on any other morning. The unit moved past the alcove without stopping. I set the iron for the fifth pass. I thought about sleeves. I thought about the angle at which the sleeve seam met the shoulder fold, and about the specific motion that allowed you to follow the seam without pressing it. A motion that was partly a rotation of the wrist, and partly a very slight change in the angle of approach that you could not describe to Someone who had not done it but that your hand knew after enough repetitions. I thought about the left sleeve, which was always slightly easier because most pressers are right-handed, and the left sleeve lies in the more natural approach position, and about the right sleeve, which required a small adjustment. The unit went upstairs to the intake bay. I did the 6th pass. When the unit came back down and went through the ground floor, and out through the service entrance, and the frequency hum faded to the distance, muffled version that told me they had moved back into the street, I was on the 8th pass. The finish pass, setting the work. I pressed the robe. I hung it on the outgoing rack. I stood at my station with my hands at my sides and let 30 seconds pass while I made sure the hum was continuing, to diminish rather than stabilizing at a distance that suggested surveillance rather than departure. Then I walked to the finishing alcove. The child was sitting against the hanging uniforms, the bundle in her lap, the fish entirely finished, watching the entrance to the alcove with those copper-green eyes. She had not moved. She was very still. I had the thought, looking at her, that her father had taught her this stillness, had made sure she knew it, understood that there would be a time when her life depended on being able to hold herself motionless and quiet in an uncertain space for as long as it took. I sat down on the floor across from her. "We need to go," I said. "There's a window now. The perimeter has moved outward. If we use the window before they complete the arc and come back, we have a clear route to the Port Authority complex." She held the bundle against her chest and looked at me. "The oversight desk," I said. "The petition reception. Your father set this up so that once the archive is formally received by the oversight authority, the process has to happen. They can't stop it from outside. It's built into the mechanism." She said something I caught, the word for correct and the word for reception, and a legal term I only half understood, but which had the shape of inevitability to it. Something that, once set in motion, not be interrupted by the parties it implicated. "Exactly," I said. "We just have to get it there." We went out through the side entrance again. The Rue des Pêcheurs was its midday self. Delivery vehicles, administrative foot traffic, the human market vendors with their carts against the facades. The harbor was visible at the end of the street, blue-gray and wide and very bright in the noon light, with the Vreth administrative flag above the Port Authority complex lifting in the harbor wind. The flag was large and formal and moved with the particular gravity of flags that represent entities that take themselves seriously. There was one enforcer at the junction of the Rue des Pêcheurs and the harbor approach road. A single fixed position unit, the kind that was deployed after a compression sweep to maintain coverage at key points, while the main pursuit team extended the perimeter. It stood at the junction, breathing the air, and watching the street with the compound eyes, turning slowly, the way a lighthouse turns, consistent and mechanical and thorough. I adjusted the pressing cloth around the child so that she was more completely covered, with her face turned toward my shoulder. I had explained what we were doing, and she had understood, and she had arranged herself against me, with the same stillness she had maintained in the alcove. A practiced absence of presence, the ability to take up less space in the world's attention than her actual size. I walked toward the junction. I thought about the pressing iron. I thought about the weight of it in my hand, the specific heft of a cast iron pressing plate compared to the lighter alloy plates some shops used, and how the cast iron held temperature more consistently, even if it was heavier to manage. I thought about the pressing queue waiting for me, the items I had not yet gotten to, the order in which they would need to be worked. I thought about the 8th pass, the finish pass, and about the particular satisfaction of a finish pass done correctly, the way the last stroke settled the work and made it definitive, the way a period settles a sentence. We passed the enforcer. I walked the remaining 80 meters to the Port Authority complex, without changing pace and without looking back. The public access lobby was everything I had always found uncomfortable about official Vreth spaces, designed consciously or otherwise, to remind the people entering it that they were entering on tolerance rather than on right, that the ceiling was high because the space was built for creatures taller than them, that the ambient sound of the administrative equipment running behind the walls was present at a frequency that the Vreth staff did not notice and human visitors felt in their bones. There were two administrative clerks at the petition desk, both in standard duty robes, the kind I had pressed many times, 8 passes to correct finish, and a queue of 3 human individuals ahead of me, waiting with the specific patience of people who have been through this before, and have calibrated their expectations downward to the level where disappointment is no longer possible. I stood in the queue. The child stood beside me, the bundle held against her chest, looking up at the space around her. I watched her looking at it, and I thought about what this building meant to her. Not the inconvenience and ambient unease it meant to me and to the other humans in the queue, but what the sight of the administrative flag meant to a child who had spent the morning hiding in the back of a vehicle and then running through the back streets of a city that did not know she was there. Whether she read the building as rescue or as another form of the apparatus that had taken her father from her, I could not answer that. I did not have enough language or enough knowledge of what her father had built this mechanism to protect her from, specifically, and what he had trusted it to deliver to her. I only knew that he had built it, which told me something about the kind of person he had been. The clerk ahead of the queue finished. The next person moved up. I moved forward in the line and thought about nothing in particular: the harbor, light, the color of the water, the specific quality of the air in port cities that you can identify blindfolded if you have lived in them long enough, the particular mixture of salt and fuel and organic material. From the harbor floor that is different in every port city, but is always recognizably harbor. I reached the desk. The clerk looked at me, looked at the coat, looked at the child. I said in pidgin, formal receipt request, lineage archive submission, unaffiliated minor, disrupted lineage authority. I had worked out the words during the queue. The legal terms were from the formal vreth the child had used with me, which I had been turning over in my memory since she first spoke them, and I was not certain I was pronouncing them correctly, but they were the right terms, and they were said with enough assurance that the clerk's compound eyes shifted to the child, rather than back to me, which I took as a sign that the substance had landed, even if the pronunciation had not been flawless. The child stepped forward and placed the bundle on the petition counter. The clerk looked at the bundle. Then the clerk opened it, carefully, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has touched an unexpected thing and is taking a moment to understand what they are holding. The data archive inside was exactly what it was: small physical, sealed in the old format, carrying the stamps and signatures of the official whose name was on it. The clerk did not move for a moment. A stillness settled over them that was different from the ordinary stillness of administrative processing. Then they said something in formal vreth at a register I could not follow, and the second clerk came over. They conferred. A door behind the petition desk opened, and a senior official came through it. I recognized the rank from the robe and the way the clerks responded to the presence. Not deference exactly, but a reorganization of the space around the official. The way junior staff reorganized themselves around authority, physical grammar that was readable across species lines. The official was older than the administrative vreth I dealt with at the blanchisserie, carrying the particular density of age that comes in any species from decades of consequential work. They looked at the archive. They looked at the child. They spoke to the child in formal vreth. The exchange between them was long enough that I had time to observe it without being able to follow it, and I watched the child's posture during the exchange change incrementally, not relaxing exactly, but settling, as though something she had been braced against had begun to give. The grip on the bundle loosened. The official looked at me. I stood in a coat that was not mine, in a laundry worker's posture, in the public access lobby of the Port Authority complex, and did not say anything. There was nothing to say. I was what I appeared to be, a man who had walked a child across a city and then walked her through a door. The rest of it was administrative. The official spoke to the clerk. The clerk produced an administrative tablet and a stylus, and wrote something, and slid the tablet across the counter. It was a formal receipt. My name, the clerk had asked, and I had given it, and a case reference number, and a timestamp, and the administrative seal of the Regional Oversight Authority of the Vreth Colonial Administration, pressed in the old physical format, rather than the digital one, which meant it was a record that existed outside the network system and could not be revised by anyone with access credentials. I picked up the receipt. I looked at it for a moment. I folded it and put it in the breast pocket of the coat. The child looked up at me then, and I looked down at her. Copper green eyes were as complete in their attention as they had been when I first opened the privacy barrier in the vehicle that morning, but the character of the attention had changed. Not the inventory of a new and uncertain situation, but something else, something I could not name precisely and did not try to, because naming it would have required a category I did not have. She spoke quietly, formal breath. I caught individual words and the shape of the whole, the word for shelter and the word forgiven, and a word I had not heard before, but which settled into me with the weight of something that had always been true and was only now being said aloud. A word for a kind of debt that is not a burden, that is carried differently, that keeps a person upright in weather that would otherwise knock them down. A word for the thing that remains between people after the dangerous morning is over and the ordinary morning begins again. I nodded. She went through the door with the official and the clerks into the interior of the Port Authority complex, and I stood in the lobby for a moment longer than I needed to, and then turned and walked back out into the noon light. The enforcement units had gone. The frequency hum was distant, somewhere in the residential district to the northwest, still working the spiral, still, for a target who was no longer in the territory they were covering. The harbor was blue-gray and wide, and the flag above the complex was moving in the harbor wind. And the Rue des Pêcheurs was the Rue des Pêcheurs. It always was, and which I understood walking back, down it. I was glad to see. I went back to the blanchisserie through the side entrance. Siga was at his station. The pressing queue had grown in my absence. A full afternoon's work backed up behind my empty station. He did not look at me when I came in. I took the coat off. I folded it and put it back on the unclaimed rack where I had found it that morning, smoothed the shoulders, made sure it hung correctly. I put on my work coveralls. I went to my station. I picked up the next item in the queue, and I pressed it. The coat was gone from the unclaimed rack when I checked at the end of the day. I assumed someone had claimed it, the owner, or Madame Ravang, having decided the unclaimed period had expired and disposed of it in the standard way. I did not ask. There were things at the blanchisserie that you did not ask about, and the coat had become one of them, by virtue of having been on my back all morning. I did not know, and still do not know with certainty, what happened in the administrative proceedings that followed. I know that the enforcement pursuit operation was formally closed within the week because the Regional Oversight Authority had received a formal complaint filing that triggered a mandatory review process which suspended all related enforcement activity. I know this because the enforcement hum in the streets changed. There is a different character to the sound when the units are in maintenance mode rather than active pursuit, and the city's frequency changed from one to the other over the course of 3 or 4 days. I know that the official whose name was not spoken during my morning with the child eventually departed Vela for a posting elsewhere, the kind of posting that is technically a promotion and is understood by everyone to be its opposite. I know this because Rue Siga told me, shh, which meant it had circulated through the blanchisserie supply of administrative information, which was the most reliable current events digest in the harbor district. I know that 3 days after the morning I have described, Aminata came in on Thursday as she always did and placed the uniforms on the counter. She completed her transaction with Madame Ravang and picked up her receipt, and as she turned to leave she looked up and looked directly at me for the first time in 2 years. She held the look for a moment, did not say anything. She did not say anything. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you are revising your understanding of who they are, not dramatically, not with any particular expression, but with the specific quality of attention that means you have decided to update your information. Then she left. I went back to my iron. I have thought about that morning many times in the years since. I have tried to understand what was useful about me. Not in the sense of feeling satisfied about it. Seems like the wrong response to a set of events that involved a dead man, a child in a torn robe, and more adrenaline than I normally prefer in a single morning. but in the sense of trying to understand what I actually did that worked, so I can know what it was. I think the answer is simple and not particularly flattering to analyze. The enforcement units were very good at finding people who were afraid of being found. They had been built and trained and refined over many generations to find people who were afraid. Their entire capability was oriented toward the biochemistry of human fear and guilt and flight, which they could read at distances and precisions that no human sensory system could match. What they had not been built for was a man pressing a uniform, not a man pretending to press a uniform, not a man forcing himself to stand at a pressing iron and perform the actions of pressing while his mind ran over every possible exit from the but a man actually pressing a uniform, thinking about the temperature and the pass sequence and the angle of approach on the sleeve seam, because that is the work and the work is what there is. Not heroism, not strategy, just the specific, trained, practiced absorption in an ordinary task that a person develops when they have done the task 10,000 times, and the task has become part of what they are. The breath enforcers were looking for someone afraid. They were very good at finding afraid. They were not equipped to find someone at work. I do not think this is a limitation they will correct. I think it is a limitation that comes from a fundamental assumption about how humans function: pressure. An assumption built on a great deal of evidence and a great deal of successful enforcement history, and which is almost always correct. People who are running from something tend to run. People who are hiding tend to hide. The biochemistry cooperates. But every so often, in a particular kind of person, in a particular kind of circumstance, the work is enough. The work takes the place of everything else and the body tells the truth. And the truth is that a man with nothing, no weapon, no rank, no plan, no connections to anyone who might help, nothing but 2 years of practice with a pressing iron and a willingness to walk back in the direction he come from, is not always findable by the methods designed to find him. I pressed the robes. The steam came up clean through the plate. The morning finished itself the way mornings do when you let them. One item at a time, one pass at a time, Q, diminishing at the rate it always diminishes when you do not think about it and simply work. Siga left at the end of his shift without a word, which was his custom. Jerry left. The evening presser came in and took his station. The harbor kept its color outside the windows, blue-gray and bright. The same color it had been when I arrived, and the same color it would be when I left. I finished my shift. That is all there is to tell.